and Chris is going to be talking about just making multi-vendor cloud work. I think I've reordered your words just a little bit, but anyway, take it away. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks to the VSF and Bob for having me here. And we're going to talk a little bit of, like I said, about just making this all work. See, I rearranged the words too, Brad. All right, so there's a few industry trends that we're trying to address here with this work. It's undeniable that a lot of production is moving to the cloud, or at the very least to hybrid environments. And you need to be able to accommodate that, and with that you end up with multi-vendor, multi-platform environments. And as you move to the cloud, all of a sudden security becomes a big issue that you need to consider. When we used to have everything on-prem, we could air-gap things to the cloud. We had security, right? Because we had no connection to the internet, to the outside public world. However, when you're moving things to the cloud, there are additional things you need to consider in the area of security. So kind of a few industry trends that need to be considered with this move to the cloud and to hybrid environments. So, the goal of what we're trying to solve here is making it as easy as possible to secure, connect, and control multi-vendor ecosystem across multiple platforms of services and microservices. Notice I'm not just talking about microservices here. So the way we felt was the best to kind of approach this is not by having one particular company coming out and saying this is the way things should be done, and trying to impose that. We felt like standardization, getting an industry-wide approach together was probably the right way to do this. And there were a few things that kind of needed to be tackled here. If you're going to solve this problem of multi-vendor, multi-platform interoperability for media services and products, again, you need to come up with something generic enough that it's going to work for everybody who wants to connect into it. You need to be able to make this work for any vendors who want to adapt it. Again, powerful enough to make it actually operate, but at the same time, making it efficient enough so it doesn't bog down large-scale systems. You have the risk when you move things to the cloud, and particularly when you move things to a microservices type of architecture, of having a ton of different endpoints there. And you could easily get yourself bogged down with massive network traffic. So you need to be able to deal with that. Plug and play, I have to always get that buzzword in there, right? But really the key with plug and play here in this kind of environment, if you're going to make multiple vendor solutions work across platforms, you need to be able to plug and play in services and devices without taking the entire system down. You need to be able to bring them in dynamically, have them recognized, and get them operational seamlessly. And so that's one of the other big goals here. And of course, I'm going to keep harping on security. It needs to be secure enough for hybrid cloud and ground environments. So the solution, the proposal for this is something that we're calling Catena. And that's not accidental. The word Catena, for those who aren't familiar with it, means a connected series of related things. So I thought that was an appropriate name for something that helps to connect multi-vendor services across the media ecosystem. And so what Catena is and what it will be is like it says here, a proposed standard to address all these goals that we're trying to accomplish. The good news is this is not just something that came out of somebody's brain and was made out of a blank sheet of paper. Really the basis for this has been proven for many, many years in something that Ross Video has had called Open Gear. For those not familiar with it, at the foundation of Open Gear is something called OGP, which is the Open Gear Protocol, which currently is used across a wide variety of products, not only from Ross, but dozens and dozens of partner companies out there. And at any particular moment, there are probably tens of thousands of OGP messages flowing across the media ecosystem, making devices interoperate. Now, when you look at Open Gear and OGP, that has always been a Ross Video thing. And it's been controlled by Ross Video, and like we say, benevolently, trying to make it as open as possible. And it was designed to bring in multi-vendor solutions. However, the whole Open Gear concept started about 16 years ago. None of us were thinking about the cloud and running everything that we do in the cloud or across hybrid environments 16 years ago. So we took a step back recently and said, if we were to take a look at what here makes sense and what can be, what perhaps needs to be improved for cloud and hybrid environments, what would we do? And so the first thing that we decided here is that if this is going to be widely adapted or adopted for hybrid and cloud environments, we need to stop it being just a Ross Video only type of thing. That it should be an open standard, and in fact we should open source things wherever possible to release it to the industry and let people use it, not have it controlled by us. We think it would enjoy much better adoption, and frankly, we don't need the overhead of controlling something like this. So Ross Video has taken this work to a group called the OSA, the Open Services Alliance, which is specialized in media microservices. And once that work has come through the OSA, the goal is for that to go to SMPTE for full standardization. You notice earlier I said open source as well, and that might not be an obvious thing when you're talking about standards or SMPTE, but we also do plan to release an open source set of libraries for the community to access freely and use as they see fit, that will be a companion to the actual standard itself. All right, so enough kind of high-level arm waving. What really is this? When we talk about Catena, there are really 6 primary components that we're talking about here in terms of defining. The first would be registration. So it's very important, of course, if you've got a bunch of services, devices, microservices from a variety of vendors, they need to be able to register themselves and say, hey, I'm a service that does X, Y, and Z, or just X. If I'm a microservice, I might just do one thing. Here's who I am, here's what I control, or here's what I can do, and here's how to control me. We need to have a way to exchange status between these services and devices, methods, obviously, for controlling them with commands and APIs. Security, we'll go into a little more detail in a few minutes, but the basic here is that it's based on zero trust tenets. And then finally, this all enables orchestration. And that's one thing I want to make very, very clear here, is that Catena itself is not an orchestration system. It enables orchestration. You can use whatever orchestration method or system or product that you would like to use with Catena. It just makes it easier. All right, so I kind of talked a little bit about this earlier of what kind of services does this apply to. It could be microservices that do just one single thing. It could be an entire monolithic application. Doesn't need to be a microservice, or it could be something in between. And the idea is, again, this is designed from the cloud up to work in cloud environments, also hybrid environments, and on-prem as well. So this can work in any environment you want with any size service, device, product you'd like to apply it to. And just to give a visual to this is, at the whole core of Catena, you've got a device of some kind or a service that you're going to plug in. And that could be, from left to right here, you could have a very large, traditional type of monolithic software application. You could have a really big on-prem device that could be connected into the Catena ecosystem. Microservices, you can have very, very small on-prem devices. So this is a very lightweight protocol that can work for even the smallest of on-prem devices, or even, it's not even necessarily only devices and services that directly touch media. It could be a robot. It could be a light. It could be a coffee maker. It could be anything you want it to be. Any kind of device that you want to be able to discover, control, and have interoperate with others could be a candidate to be connected using Catena. So it's very broad in its scope. So, and you'll kind of see along the right here, kind of reinforcing that, where we've got cloud deployed technologies, deploying technologies on hardware, or also in virtualized environments. Again, this works equally well for all of those. So the idea is that I attach a device. It says, hey, I'm device X. Here's what I can do. We have a set of commands that can be used to control them. And as you connect more and more devices, you end up with an interoperable, basically an ecosystem that can all interoperate. One of the key things at the bottom here is the idea behind this is you don't need, if you have a device or a service, you do not need to have developers go in and write code to work under Catena. As long as it speaks this OGP, Open Gear Protocol, it should all work. Again, this is trying to keep it as lightweight as possible, as easy to implement as possible. So, in terms of interaction with devices, obviously a device needs to be able to respond to a query to say, oh, I see you just connected in here. Who are you? What can you do? How can I use you? And the response that device then provides back can include things of, well, here's all the parameters that I've got that you can control. Here's the different statuses that I can provide to you. If there are any APIs or commands that you support, it's basically describing itself, introducing itself, and saying, okay, here's who I am, do with me what you will. So that's kind of the way this is all architected. And like I said, going back to the plug and play thing, it's important to note, though, that this all happens dynamically, that you can plug a device into an already running facility ecosystem, and it's discovered, its capabilities are known, and it can be controlled in a live environment without having to kind of reset or do anything to bring it on board. Another important concept is, I'd mentioned that we're not just talking microservices or even small services here. We could talk full devices here. So with that, you can actually have sub-devices. There are devices out there that can do many different things, right? And so you can break those down into sub-devices, and each one of those sub-devices then can have its own set of parameters, commands, menus that can be defined, and those could be different for every sub-device within a big device. So that's how we deal with large systems, large devices that can do multiple things. If you only want to discover and use a portion of that device, we can use sub-devices to do that. Again, keeps it very streamlined and efficient in terms of network traffic. So I kind of mentioned parameters earlier. So when we're talking about parameters for devices, quite simple. You've got, what is the type of a parameter? Are we talking an integer, floating point, string, whatever? It can be a single parameter, a single value, or it could be an array or a full structure. You can have constraints, enumeration lists of legal values, that sort of thing. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. You can also have a little UI widget hint. And like I mentioned earlier, so Catena is not itself an orchestration or control system, but you can, it does provide with these parameters hints so that if you want to control a device, it'll say, Well, the best way to characterize this device on a UI would be with this type of control. So it makes it very easy. You don't have to say, well, do I do this with a slider? Do I do this with a knob? What's the best way to do it? It'll say, I recommend you do it this way in your UI. Again, helps you to build up Catena compliant systems pretty quickly. And so that was parameters. So the parameters, I think we all know what a parameter is, right? It's something that you can read. You're discovering what something can do. Commands are more, do this. And so based on the parameters that we've got from the system, you can say, issue a command and say, okay, do this particular thing. The important thing that I want to point out, though, here is at the bottom is every parameter and command in Catena has what we call an OID, an object identifier, which uniquely identifies that particular item. Incredibly important to be able to track that for a variety of reasons. I mentioned earlier about status. So here's an example. So let's say, for instance, very simple. We've got a service, and all it can do is play one channel of video. Okay, about as basic as you can get. So it can be discovered, and like I said earlier, it responds to queries about what it can do. It says, hey, I can play a channel of video. What would the status parameters be in that case? Well, you could have things of what its playout state is currently, what are the audio meter values for it, what does sync look like, that sort of thing. Whereas with control, again, we're talking about playing out one channel of video. Well, with control, we could say, I want you to play out starting at this in point. I want you to stop at a particular out point, that sort of thing. And then in the command areas, you could say, okay, I want you to play or stop, or I want you to play at 2 times speed, whatever, a variety of different things. So hopefully this gives an illustration of just how simple really this whole parameter control and status structure is within Catena. Another thing that's incredibly important here is this is all asynchronous. And the reason for that is, again, if you expand this out and start thinking about this on a microservice scale, where you could be talking about hundreds or even thousands of services with a ridiculous number of parameters, you need to architect this in such a way it's not going to bog down your network unduly. And so that is kind of at the heart of all this, and I think that's something that's very unique about all this is that it's built to scale. Security. I promised to go back to security, and that's obviously an incredibly crucial thing and one of the biggest areas of emphasis that we've had in developing the Catena specification. So as I mentioned earlier in my little teaser on security, this does follow the zero trust tenets, which we think is the right way to do this. And it does this to achieve traffic management, obviously secure communications, observability in terms of being able to be audited and availability. And in large part, we said, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel here. We think that OAuth 2 and IS10 has done a terrific job in this area, so absolutely no reason for us to duplicate that work. Our preference is just to reference it and say, hey, we think this has already been tackled. This is the way to do it. And we've done that in a few different areas. You'll see there are a few different areas that we thought, hey, there's already prior art here. Why do we need to invent this? And so we didn't. So the idea here is for Catena to be, in quotation marks, a good citizen within a zero trust architecture. If you haven't heard of zero trust, I'm assuming most people in the world are in the room are familiar with zero trust, but it's absolutely a trend in the industry. One of the approaches that we've taken here, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, is using something called a policy enforcement point, or a PEP. So if we have a person going through a system that wants to get access to execute something, they have to go through a policy enforcement point, which goes and has a conversation with a policy decision point here, which is basically making the decision of, do you get in or do you not get in? And if you do, what kind of access do you get to the resource that you're trying to access? And so what the policy enforcement point will do for you is if you do not have access to something, it will strip that out completely, and that request will not make it through the PEP. Or let's say you only have read-only access to a particular thing, you're not allowed to modify it, it will enforce that as well. Or if you're trying to do something that's completely outside of the scope that you're authorized to do, it's going to reject that. And so what we see is there's probably going to be a number of engineering guidelines or recommended practices, things like that, around how this is all handled. So, like I said earlier, for authentication specifically, we're looking at IS-10 or its underlying technology. We think this is the right way to do this. And one thing that we think is something that you got to keep in mind, again, with an eye towards scaling, is that if you look at the bottom here, if you've got X number of clients, whatever that is, multiply that by the number of devices that they're trying to access over Catena, and then the number of access scopes they might have. And I think I've got something maybe on the next slide that talks about access scopes. The number of variables you end up there becomes absolutely massive. And so scale becomes very challenging here. So we've kept that in mind in the design of all this and how we deal with security and authentication. So hate to expose you to a new acronym, but we think this one has some energy behind it, right? So we came up with this acronym. Mr. Naylor in the audience gets right of authorship to this, called GUSTO, the Grand Unified. Sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? Scopes theory, optimized for media production. It was originally GUST, and we thought, well, GUSTO sounds a little bit better, so added the optimized bit in there. So what is GUSTO, and how do you do security with GUSTO? The idea behind this is with RBAC, with role-based access control, that you can define a set of roles that people have. So here's some examples. I'm a journalist, or I'm a producer, or I'm a technical director. I'm somebody in SecOps. And each one of those roles has a certain set of implied access rights. So for instance, a producer, in this case, you could have a particular user who fulfills the role of I'm a journalist sometimes, and I have a certain set of rights for that. Or if I'm a producer, I have a completely different set of rights. And so it's a way of kind of simplifying access. And so within a device in the Catena ecosystem, all these parameters and commands I was talking about earlier, we can assign them all what we call a risk level. So it's basically, what kind of exposure do I have if something bad happens using this parameter or command? And then let's map those across to the various levels of rights that people can have. And so again, if I've got somebody here who can be a producer and they're trying to access a particular service, they have a particular set of rights for that service. They might have a different set of rights for another service. So again, this is a way, I think, to handle this pretty simply. All right. In terms of transport, well, we are at VidTrans, so I've got to talk about transport a little bit here. In terms of transport, yes, we do talk about transport in Catena. Again, back to, I haven't counted before how many times I say plug and play in this. It's probably excessive, right? But it's a key point that this is all plug and play. In terms of transport, though, we have a serializer for the data. Obviously, you've got to have a deserializer on the other end. And then in the spirit of not inventing anything that we don't need to, we've adopted gRPC, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, the Google Remote Procedure Call. And we think that addresses a lot of the concerns that we've got in terms of transport. So the idea here is, I'm not going to go over everything on this slide, but the idea here is to use open source where possible to build a standardized mechanism for exchange of this data. We also use protobufs, so using Proto3 definitions, again, porting toward a standard where possible, using protobufs, using gRPC. Again, it ticked a lot of boxes where we didn't have to worry about things, and they already come all packaged up nicely for us using industry. I'll use this term standards, although maybe not exactly standards, but best practices that are out there. Orchestration, I mentioned earlier, Catena is not orchestration, but it does enable orchestration. It makes it a whole lot simpler out there. So, when I talk about orchestration, and I think orchestration has the danger of being, it's a very overloaded term out there. Different people mean different things when they say orchestration. When I talk about orchestration here, I'm talking about everything that needs to be done in order to, when a device is introduced into a system, to make it ready to operate. That's really what we mean by orchestration in this case. Obviously, it's also included in that is making sure that the services or devices that you're controlling are still there, they're still healthy, they're still operational. Kind of one of the open questions that we've got down here is, there are plenty of technologies out there right now that do orchestration. And, we're not recommending any particular approach or product, but, the question is, should there be something that's recommended for this? We don't really know. We're kind of leaving that as an open question right now. All right, so again, what's in scope of orchestration? Kind of talked about this already, being able to have a device to describe itself to the orchestration system. Let's see, I think I was going to go down to... Yeah, okay, let's actually skip to the next slide. The UI menu hints I talked about earlier, I think that's a really powerful thing to make it very easy to deploy Catena and write your own control around all of this and nice UIs. So in terms of the two features that we've got around UI hints, each of these OIDs, the object identifiers that I mentioned earlier, for each parameter and command, you have this hint, and so it could say, oh yeah, drop-down menu would make sense for this, or like I said, a vertical slider, a row of buttons, whatever. This would be the way we recommend that this get implemented. And then there's kind of an optional menu section here. And so again, you can stand up a user interface very quickly. If you just take these hints, you don't have to, but they're ways to accelerate your UI development. Again, this does not provide a full UI. It just makes it easier for you to create a UI. Just a little note at the bottom here. We have had for quite a while here something called OGLML, the Open Gear markup language. We're not planning on making that part of the Catena specification, but it is something that could be used. So just be aware there is a markup language around here that you could use for this. Discovery, I think we covered a lot of this ground already in terms of being able to discover devices. The natural question would be, well, what about ISO 4 that already does this? And again, in the spirit of not reinventing anything we don't need to reinvent, we're absolutely looking at what's being done with ISO 4, and can we borrow from that and use already in use best practices around discovery. So just to wrap this all up, we think this has a huge value to the industry. We've been socializing this Catena idea for a while among our OpenGear partners, among our key customers. I have yet to hear from anybody who says, well, what a terrible idea, stop doing that. Pretty much everybody has said this solves a real problem that we've got out there, and a problem that is only going to be exacerbated as we move more and more to cloud and hybrid environments, and as we move more and more to microservices, frankly, and you fragment this more and more, you end up with more vendors having to interoperate. It's a problem that's maybe this big today. We can see in 5 years this could be something like this. So this is the time to address this. If you'd like to get involved, we'd love to have your involvement. The plan is to have the Catena live in the OSA for a few months going forward and get it to a 80 to 90% good enough point before handing it off to SMPTE to become a standard. And this is kind of the timeline of what we're looking at. We did present Catena at a microservices summit in New York in January. That was kind of considered the launch of it. For the next 9 months or so, the goal is to refine all the draft documents. I mentioned the 6 areas that we plan on focusing on. The plan is to stand up the open source project and open that up by around NAB time and allow people to access that and provide input there. And the perhaps ambitious goal is to present final versions of this to SMPTE around the IBC timeframe. So this is not very far ahead. We acknowledge this is aggressive, but we think we need to be aggressive with this sort of thing. If we don't get this done, if we take 5 years to do this, it's going to be too late. People will have already moved on and done their own thing. So time is of the essence with this. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, I see some people running for the mic. Whoever gets there first, you will need to turn it on and wait for a moment for it to start. So go ahead, Andy, turn the mic on.
I think it's on. Yes, good. Thanks, Chris. Excellent presentation. 3 very quick questions, a couple of which you've alluded to. First of all, you've talked about some NMOS elements, IS-10 and 04 in reference. With the work that's going on IS-12 for modeling and control, there seems to be, in my mind, some overlap there, some significant overlap. So I wonder if you can comment on that. Just second question, when you say it's going to SMPTE, does that mean you're relinquishing ROS control of it, so it will be completely open, is question number 2.
Okay.
And question number 3 is, how do you handle ephemeral or non-persistent devices, which by very nature of what we have in cloud infrastructure, is there a model to handle that non-persistence in the way you have approached it? Thank you.
Well, geez, I'm going to have to remember all 3 questions.
So the first one is IS-12. Yeah.
Yes, IS-12, that's an easy one. So we have the Catena group has already met with the IS-12 group and kind of did let us introduce Catena to you, tell us what IS-12 does, and let's try to figure out, is it possible to either combine these or figure out where they have some commonality and where they have some differences. And I think we've accomplished that in terms of there are some fundamental differences, even though there's absolutely overlap, and they're trying to solve some of the same problems. But there were some areas where there were significant enough divergence that we felt that merging the efforts at this point was not really practical. IS-12 was going down a particular road with a particular set of use cases it was trying to solve for, and we were going down a slightly different path. So basically, we agreed to keep the conversation going. We do not want to create additional confusion in the industry, but in terms of kind of merging them together, that was something that we felt couldn't be done right now. But there is an ongoing conversation around that.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers the IS-12
question.
question.
Fully open was question number 2.
Yes, fully open. Yes. And that's we've characterized this as ROS Video's gift to the industry. We are relinquishing, kind of control of this. The idea is it will become a SMPTE standard or set of engineering documents that ROS Video will not control. And we recognize that by sending it off to SMPTE. What happens to it, right? But we think that's important for it to be more widely accepted and deployed, that it's not just a ROS Video kind of thing. And like I said, taking the open gear type of model for it is really impractical in terms of management when you're talking about microservices and the number of vendors. So we have no interest in continuing to control that for the Catena type of environment.
Okay, I'm going to, moderator prerogative. No, stay there. Don't go away. I'm just going to interject something because we actually have some extra time. So we'll get to everybody's questions here. Could you roll back one slide?
Yeah.
So pursuant to the question that Andy asked, present final versions to SMPTE to go into, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. So at that point, you're kind of through the kind of ROS discussions or the OSI discussions, and then that's where, in theory, fingers crossed, that'll go to be submitted as an input to the SMPTE for them to start their process.
Correct.
Okay, got it.
And we're maybe naively, maybe not, but we're encouraged that we can get that through relatively rapidly. We've done 4 projects so far out of the OSA into SMPTE that have, I'm knocking on this, appears to be real wood, that have gone through pretty rapidly through the SMPTE process. So we're guardedly optimistic, although we recognize taking it to SMPTE opens up, to comment, that sort of thing, but we think we can get it through it in a reasonable amount of time. I'm not going to put a date on that.
Okay, great. Andy?
I love aggressive time ambition. That's really, really, really impressive. The third one was the non-persistent ephemeral, configuring devices that are non-persistent or ephemeral in their own right.
Yep.
Have you handled that?
Yeah, it's absolutely intended to work for that. That's the very nature of microservices, right?
Yeah.
That you stand up a service, use it, and then you might have a similar job 5 minutes later and use a completely different service, right? So it's not stood up for very long at all. So this is intended to work equally well for that. It's very lightweight intentionally so that it can be used for the smallest of services, or like I said earlier, or even implemented on very small hardware devices if you want it to. So yes, that is absolutely kept in mind. And I have to keep myself from always saying microservices here, but really the key that this is architected around is microservices.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So Chris, as I think you know, we're taking a really hard look at this in the RIST activity group. And we've definitely got some concerns about whether this is going to be fully supportive of the RIST model of business. And so specifically, what I was curious about is devices that are highly mobile. In other words, they may be transiting through different network environments while they're doing their job. They might need to register with multiple different service providers simultaneously. And preserving the identity we really know that we have to have a control protocol. We want to be able to do a cold boot. You send somebody a piece of gear, and we want to be able to totally configure it from a central location. We always talk about Rick and at CBS wants to put a box, ship it to a reporter, and that reporter needs to know absolutely nothing about it, maybe than how to recognize a RJ45 connection. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is properly considered in your architecture, or do you need some more input? Or what can we do to help with this to make it something that's really going to suit the needs of the RIST application environment?
Yeah, so as you know, we do have some representation in that area, and so we've absolutely kept that in mind with this. Is future coordination warranted? Absolutely. And so I think the more crossover we can have between the RIST group in VSF and the effort that's going on here, the better. And the earlier we can do that, the more assured we can be that we're not going off in a direction that's orthogonal to what you want to do in your area. So we do have at least one ROS video person I can think
Yep.
of who's involved there, who's trying to coordinate, but happy to have more
All right.
cross communication going on. But yes, the idea is that all works nicely. But are we RIST experts? Well, maybe one of our people is sort
Okay.
of, but yeah.
All right. Well, we look forward to working with you. So great.
Thanks. Likewise.
And if I could just tag on to that, Wes, one thing you might want to be aware is that within the AMWA, and you might want to too if I think you are aware of it.
Yep.
We have very strong input from our user community in the AMWA about what we're calling configuration, separate from control. And once you start talking about this whole topic of device control, it's a hydra, right? So the strong input that we have is around that initial configuration of devices. And so at some point, there's probably a conversation that needs to be had amongst the different groups to see if we can come up with a common approach to it. So we'll actually, next week I'm here for IPMX. The week after that, I'm in UK for a discussion where we're going to be talking about exactly that, Wes, among other things. Carl.
To carry a little bit beyond what Brad just said, this makes sense for the cloud environment, but for years, those that have been building IP plants have been wondering, when are we going to have the control and command portions of that system that goes outside the bounds of a controller? And I'm wondering, or I would expect from your comments, that this could be implemented at a ground-based only system, such as a data center.
Absolutely.
Or a broadcast control system.
Yep.
So
Yeah, this is not cloud only by any
Yeah,
stretch.
and in fact, I think we've got some applications where this might be applicable sooner rather than later if the conditions.
The coffee maker
surface.
example that I gave.
Yeah. The other part of it is I'm reminded, as certainly you and I as chair of 34CS and co-chairs of 34CS for years, we saw many attempts at this blow up in its face over the years, and we still have the contention that AES 70 is attempting and has been attempting for years to trial this by fire, and it's gone nowhere.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that and I would expect that the group has learned already that the absent portions of AES 70, and that we can move this for a usable activity in something like 2110-40 for distribution as a metadata system rather than just 291, 292 type environments for ancillary data. Just some comments.
Yep. No, that's all good advice. And Carl, you and I have the scars from that. So, yeah, well aware of it.
I thought it was interesting you're using OAuth. Is OAuth really the right protocol as it's so web browser focused? We use OAuth for our accounting system. We try to do batch jobs at 2 a.m. and then you get prompts at 2 a.m. to type in your password and put in all these codes on your phone. And is that really the right system? Because on-prem certainly, I want to make a switcher cut. Oh, I've got to put my password in and enter my code on my phone and I have to be on air. It assumes there's someone with a point-and-click web browser. I know they have a TV profile, but is this really the right authentication solution?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I may have skipped over it on one of the slides, but we believe the right approach to this, because yes, that can totally get in the way if you're dealing with if you're accessing parameters once a frame. Do you want to be authenticating that 30 times a second? And the answer is obviously no. That's so taking a strict OAuth 2 type of approach. I would characterize what we're looking at doing as more of a media adapted version of that to be a little more realistic in terms of not getting in the way of workflows. And John, you got the expert on this right here.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the concern was that using OAuth 2 would require over-frequent re-authentication.
But also headless devices that don't have a person in a web browser.
That use service accounts. But let me answer the first one. That when you go to an OAuth 2 authorization server and authenticate, you will be given 2 tokens. A session token, which can be as long as you want, 12 hours, and an access token,
But you still
which can be
do that,
ephemeral.
you do that through a browser. It's still all browser-based, so you need to point and click and type your name, and then sometimes put your code in on your phone. Even if that's good for a month, like it will bite you. It will bite you on the day you need it. You're not
Okay, so I think at this point, Karen, you've raised your point, and I think that's important for people to think about. The security, and I have to say on the IS-10 side, that we also have observed that security around that is challenging. And, it's something to be dealt with. We've got 2 more people, and we are running toward the end of time. But I think you've got some strong input, and certainly the AMWA has got some input on that too. So it's something for you guys to consider. Please go ahead.
Hey, Chris, Monty Vericoyas from Cobalt Digital. Applaud you for making this open source. And with that question, the open source code that you had talked about, do you have a group that's commenting on that? And can anybody participate in the development for that?
We're not quite to that point yet, but that's the direction that we're going in. So we're standing up an initial version of this. If I go back to the timeline here, by NAB, and so we're working internally right now on getting that in a reasonable enough shape to then open up to the open source community to then look at and provide your own input on. So
It's basically from your internal group that's defining
it's
this.
internal right now, but it's not
Okay.
going to be for very much longer, for about
And then-
2 months longer.
Second question, are the drafts available for review right now?
No, they're going to be, so the first, so it's going to be live within the OSA for a few months. And so the first meeting of that is actually a month from today. March 28th is when that's going to initiate, and there'll be meetings every 2 weeks, and we'll be going through over the drafts. And so, encourage you to reach out to me. I can get you engaged in that if you'd like to be part of it. Again, the earlier we get input from people, the better. Once we go down a road, we really don't want to have to backtrack and realize that we've made some fundamental, misjudgments or errors. So, love to get you involved earlier rather than later.
Okay, and one just last comment. Having the ability to use an API and or source code, and you have it easily accessible, multi-platform, multi-OS, independency, the adoption, I think, will be much better than having it hard in a lot of different areas. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Jim O'Brien from Avico. We have, for all of our life, been dealing with hundreds of broadcast manufacturers, each of which have their own API and their own security parameter. Each broadcaster of any significance has its own security architecture, carefully guarded. And I would encourage consideration of specifying part of the plant that you're going to be dealing with in this initiative. It's unlikely that Grass is going to let their production switchers get adapted to being controlled in this environment. So there are parts where this sort of thing has wonderful potential application, and there is an overreach that will result in it pretty much falling apart. You'll get some cooperation. We've been dealing with all of this all of our life, and I look forward to working with you and associates to try to focus this properly.
Yeah, the goal is to remove as many barriers as we can to people, implementing this. So that's the idea behind open standards, open source, inviting everybody to the party. We realize not everybody's going to embrace this immediately, but hopefully in the fullness of time, enough people will. And so we're just trying to make it as easy as we can.
Yeah, and the sophistication of devices, please don't underestimate that. Because, when we integrate with the Sony production switcher, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things to orchestrate. Yep. And as you know, in the overdrive area, you guys have had challenges in interfacing to the production switchers when you're kind of competing against those fellows. So these sorts of things are going to be long-standing issues. And again, thanks for your work as always.
Yeah, that whole scaling thing is at the heart of this. It's critical. If this doesn't scale well, it's not going to be adopted.
Hey, Chris. Chris Lapp from Cisco. We've talked a couple times before.
Mm-hmm.
So this is great, actually. Thank you for giving this presentation. And I can see where it really works well, especially in a single pod, Kubernetes cluster. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you stretch out to a multi-pod cluster where you have multiple machines, what's the integration point of this media control plane to be able to actually program the network control plane and the network data plane? Or have you guys started working on that? Because there's obviously going to have to be some interaction, whether you're using Envoy proxy or something else on the Kubernetes side. There has to be something to program that data plane inside the Kubernetes cluster. So what does that model look like, or have you thought about that yet?
I'm not actually sure I'm the person to answer that. We might want to take that one offline and connect you up with some people who can answer that better than I can. So just to be honest.
That's fine. I had a similar question, which is, I had a similar question which had to do with the work that the users within the AMWA have been talking about. They've really been demanding putting this stuff under CI/CD for initial deployment. And so your slides were showing, a person who wants to get access, which is we're a craft-based industry, right? So absolutely giving a person access to an editor to be able to do their craft, that's one thing. But then you know, a lot of the security, especially when you start looking at security aspects around deployment, you know, there's no-touch deployments, and you don't let any human have any access to anything, and you're using a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline to actually deploy to, I prefer the term configure the systems that then are going to be controlled perhaps through what you're talking about here. So just I've had kind of the same, I think maybe architectural questions about how do you interact with the Kubernetes deployments, CI/CD deployments, and the human craft side too. So there's quite a bit to unpack here, and there may be some helpful past art in terms of on the IT side of things and best practices there that we really ought to look at. And we should enable the craft side, in my opinion, for what it's worth. We should enable the craft side of our industry as much as we possibly can, and we should build on as much as we can of the automation and deployment in the Kubernetes and also the whole CI/CD pipelining bit. I think that's really where the best success lies.
Yeah, and I know that I've told Chris about it before, but at Cisco we kind of separated out where there's like the media controller control plane, but then there's also just a control plane and data plane for media, and we've done a lot of the work on those two, and so I'm just looking for the integration points that we could possibly work in there. But yeah, thank you.
Great. Chris, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.